Diversity is really about the breadth of experiences and identities that people bring to a particular context. Now, that's not some formal definition. That's kind of what I use to make people understand what it really means, because I think often in the United States context, people think specifically around race and gender, but it's so much broader than that. So it can be sexual identity, it can be religion, it can be disability, it can be mental health status. All of these things are what diversity is. Equity is about fairness because different people need different things. Because oftentimes people feel that inclusion is, yeah, everybody's in the room and everybody feels comfortable. But, is it one person who is always speaking? Is it one person sitting at the head of the room and everybody else is sitting, facing them, right? Or are we in a circle where everybody has the same ability to engage and there is no power position that is excluding people, right? So it's really about belonging, because now sometimes people add the DEIB and they're including the belonging, because sometimes you can think that you're being inclusive and you think you're being fair, but people still don't feel like they belong. Now, sometimes that it has a historical context that has to do with power relationships that are not necessarily in the room, but have historically existed. And so people bring those experiences, those traumas into the room. The I in DEI is inclusion. And inclusion is really about access to power. For example, if you have a room and it's structured as a circle, everybody has a similar physical space so that one person is not dominating, right? And if you're running a meeting and you take turns in terms of having different people lead the meeting, that's inclusive. And so that's what inclusivity is. I think sometimes people sit with the diversity and the equity part and forget that you have to be consciously including people. If not, you unconsciously exclude people. I think culture comes to the party along with this diversity of experiences. Depending on how recently you are in the United States, how long you've been, and how much your culture has been transmitted, you can bring unique cultural experiences to a particular context. And say, I could be adopted by a white family, and so my experiences would be totally different than if I was raised in a Black family, right? Or I might look African American, but I could be raised in a different cultural context, like in Nigeria versus Jamaica, or England or France. And so the visual piece is one part, culture is also another, for sure. Whatever inequities and disparities and discrimination and inequities that are existing in the social environment will play out in terms of people's mental and physical health, right? So obviously, if you are being raised in an environment that is hostile to who you are identity-wise, then you're going to have a much different mental health profile than someone who isn't, because you're going to have to exercise and deploy your resilience in constantly compared to someone who is more in the mainstream. That's the part that mental health is, the disparities that are there socially and politically are also going to play out in our mental health, right? And so again, you talked about trauma. Now, if you come from an African American background and there's generations of inequity, inequality, negative police interactions, maybe higher rates of incarceration, et cetera, you're going to experience mental health challenges. Also, access to care, right? So you might have mental health challenges, but your access to care in a way that affirms who you are is much more difficult. If you speak Arabic, for example, and you are a traditional Muslim and you can't go to a male, and so now you want somebody who speaks your language and is also female, imagine how limited your access to care that affirms who you are culturally, religiously, and linguistically. That's huge, right? That's really big when it comes to mental health. mental health is a social justice issue because health is a social justice issue. If there are inequities or social inequities, economic inequities, they are reflected in the experiences that we have, and so they impact our mental health, right? So I'm going to give an example. If I am a single mother of 2 children and I am working at Burger King during the pandemic, right? I have to go to work. At the same time, childcare isn't open, so I have to find somewhere for my children to go. I might not have enough money for them to each have their own iPad or whatever for whatever schooling situation they have. I'm not making a lot of money, and so my finances are always tight. That's ongoing stress. That's a very stressful situation. And so our economic disparities are going to play out in our mental health. Our access to care is also going to impact our mental health. And so again, if I have lower access to care because I don't have insurance, or I live in a place where it's very hard to find mental health care providers, it means that from a social justice perspective, I just don't have access. And even the little access I have, I can't utilize it because I can't afford it. So whatever disparities they are within a society, they are reflected in the mental health status of people. Because the more, and I'm not saying, again, I don't want it to seem like, well, if I have money and I am white and I'm upper middle class, I don't have problems. We all have problems, right? I'm just saying that in terms of your ability to bounce back, your ability to be able to respond to various stressful situations is going to vary. And so the further down the ladder you are in whatever social hierarchy there is, the more likely you are to experience negative health and negative mental health outcomes. So for example, if you're talking access to mental health services, for example, if I am a woman who speaks Arabic and I'm a traditional Muslim, and my religion may say that I cannot have close interactions with a male, then I'm going to be looking for a female mental health practitioner who speaks my language. That's not going to be as easy to find as if I am a white cisgendered female and I'm looking for a female therapist. Different ethnic and cultural groups and different economic groups see mental health services in a much different way. I have, taught social work for more than 2 decades, and I've taught it in as well as here. Worked as a social worker in the UK, in Canada, and in the United States with different populations. And I will say that there are certain groups who I've had clients and I've had students, that I've been teaching, who would say things like, when they talk about mental health to their families, depending on who they are ethnically and culturally, there's no knowledge of what that is, right? So you might go to your priest and you say a prayer, you light a candle, you find support in your social support network. But the idea of going to a stranger and telling them your family secrets, that's not a thing. In terms of getting better access to mental health services for a wide range of people, I want to give a shout out to Ayana Therapy, which is a platform specifically for people who are looking for what I would call the non-traditional therapist based on language, religion, sexual identity, ethnic, cultural identity. And it's a database where people can find therapists who meet their specific needs, because it's really hard to find. So we're going to talk about disparities in the experience of mental health in the United States, right? So for example, there are a lot of veterans who can't access care, even though there's the VA, for all kinds of different reasons. We're going to talk about affordability. So we're going to talk about, what does it mean if you do have insurance and you're still trying to find care. And we're going to talk about utilization and what are some of the barriers to utilization and how, and I try to be solution focused. So I'm not just going to talk about, well, these are the issues, but to propose some ideas for how we change the inequities, both in terms of the experience of mental health in the United States, as well as access and utilization of mental health care. And I mean, some of these, most of what I'm going to talk about, I'm not reinventing the wheel. We know that some things work. It's just a matter of how do we deploy them? How do we finance them? I blog on Psychology Today. It's called Culture in Mind. I didn't name it. Psychology Today named it. And there I provide a lot of different conversations, resources, etc., for mental health. And I also authored the stress management workbook. I do want to talk a little bit about the fact that when we're talking about diversity, that different way, like we now talk about neurodiversity, and neurodiversity has to do with different ways that our minds work, right? So that if you start to think about diversity, it's also about mental health status. Do you have people with mental health challenges in the workplace? Are there resources for them? But also, people who are on the autism spectrum, we're realizing that there are lots of things they do better than people who are not on the autism spectrum. And Walgreens, in their goal to hire more people with disabilities, started to realize that they weren't necessarily had to make adaptations. Yes, they had to make adaptations for people, but also people that thought differently also came with their own strengths for doing certain tasks. And so we have to think differently when we think about mental health and mental ability, because difference just might mean that we're differently able to do certain tasks. And so mental health is part of the realm of diversity when we're thinking about workplaces, et cetera. What I've learned in traveling across the world and talking to people who live all over the place and who have different experiences, whether it's like a homeless vet or somebody in the CEO suite, is that we all come with stories. And we all have our own. I always say, if you're on the planet, you have at least some level of resilience because you've survived some things. What benefits does this person bring to my life, to this workplace, to this particular moment? And to look at people through that lens instead of thinking, because I think a lot of times when people think of diversity, they think, oh, great, how do we have to change to make this person feel better? Am I going to have to say different things? But if you take a different approach and say, wow, this person's different from me. What can I learn from them? How can I grow because of our interaction, right? When 1 + 1 might equal 3 instead of just 2, right? Like we're better together than we are alone. And I think sometimes acceptance has a weird kind of feel to it, but for me, that's a great word, because it means as you come, I accept you as is, but I also want both of us to thrive in whatever interaction we have. And so it's about me saying, well, what is it that I can learn, and how can I bring that part of you to our interaction in whatever context that is? And that's just a different way of thinking. The perspective of saying, I see you, I want to get to know you, because there is I think the key for me has always to think about our common humanity, right? That there are things, we all have joy, we all have sadness. None of us want to see, our loved ones die. We all want a clean, safe place to live. We want good food, healthy food to eat. Like there's certain things that we experience as being human. And so fearing another human, you have to wonder why. Ask yourself, if you're feeling fear, I often tell people is ask yourself why. What is it that you're afraid of? Are you afraid of yourself, your past, are you really afraid of this person? Now, we're not talking about, physical safety, walking down the street at night or whatever, but in terms of a human interaction, is to come with an open mind and heart. And I know for some people that's really hard, but I challenge people that if you come to any moment with open heart and open mind, you're more than halfway to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? Because you're willing to hear and to listen and to really try and put yourself into somebody else's footsteps. I think, our polarization, our cultural, political polarization moment that we're in right now is because we're not willing, We're just not willing to stand in that other person's footsteps and go, okay, I can see why they think that way. I don't have to agree with them, but I have understanding, because you can't change anybody's mind without understanding. You can't work together without understanding. And so I think that's the biggest part. How do we get more diverse people into being mental health care providers? I think outreach is important, especially in immigrant communities where they might come from cultures where mental health care providers are not a normed thing. And so consideration of these professions is not necessarily top of mind. They might not even know what a marriage and family therapist is or what does a psychologist do. So there's definitely outreach and exposure and mentorship, scholarship programs. So the National Institutes of Mental Health provides scholarships for minority scholars so that you have people who are also asking research questions that will help answer certain questions that are very specific to certain populations. In my experience, the mental health care training and education that people get include cultural competence to various degrees and to various degrees of success. And so it's also important that when people are being taught and being trained, that they're exposed to a wide variety of theories that reflect diverse experiences. So I think it's really incumbent upon educators and people who are responsible for training the next generation of mental health care providers to make sure that there is equity in the understanding of what mental health looks like. There was a point at which we didn't realize that women experienced heart attacks differently than men. And that was because we just did our research on men. And so women would experience things differently and get sent home and die because we didn't even think about gender as a difference until there became an Office of Women's Health. And then we started going, oh, okay, women have different symptoms and women have different issues. And of course we should, we're different creatures, right? We have different biologies and etc. So understanding that if that can happen in physical health, it sure is going to happen in mental health. So we really have to understand the different ways in which people show up with mental health issues, as well as the different ways that we can treat. And the more tools we have, the more likely we are to find the right solution for an individual. I do think policy change could really, really significantly impact accessibility, just like mental health parity did, which said health insurance companies had to provide the same level of care to people with mental health issues as people with physical health issues. Before, they used to cap it and they would say you get 10 sessions. If you're schizophrenic and you get 10 sessions a year, you're not necessarily going to be doing very well. And so now, under the last Healthcare Act, those things can happen. So policy can really make a significant difference in access and utilization of mental health resources.